Um, so hello everyone once again. Welcome to our community demo. Today we have Joe from Magento as a speaker. Um, Joe did a really great job on creating some guides how to use Cloud Docker. He's pretty much active on community groomings we have around the same project. So he wanted to share today his experience and uh, the flows he worked on how to actually use the Docker for your cloud development if you already have a project and you never used it before locally, I mean with Cloud Docker. So let's welcome Joe, and Joe, I'll hand it over the word to you. Feel free to start when you're ready.
Okay. Let's see here, share screen. Okay, can everyone see my first slide and hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, all good.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's
Yep.
get started then. Thank you, Yevgeny, and thanks everyone for joining. So today we'll be discussing how to get your local development environment set up for specifically a Magento Cloud project using Magento Cloud's Docker implementation. And we'll be reviewing how to enter a project that might already be in progress. My name is Joe Shelton, and I am a technical lead at Magento Commerce, which is a Magento agency, and also a trainer for Magento U. And I'm active on the Magento Community Engineering Slack channel if you'd like to get a hold of me. So today we will be discussing how to set up a local development environment for a Magento Cloud project using Docker. And this Docker version is specific to, it's provided by ECE Tools version 2002.0.22. So since we're in the initial phases of this Docker implementation, a lot changes from version to version. So just make sure you're checking what version of Docker you have. The steps might not be exactly the same depending on what version you have. We're going to simulate entering a project that's already in progress. So maybe you have, maybe you've been introduced to a cloud project that has already been active for months or a year. Maybe the site is live. It's going to have products in the database, possibly customers and orders, and you would like to recreate that live environment on your local machine for development purposes. That's the workflow we'll be examining here. And this presentation will be appropriate for developers that are new to either the Magento Cloud platform or the Magento Cloud Docker implementation. There's more elegant ways to do everything I'm demonstrating today, but this is geared towards people who are maybe approaching a Magento Cloud project for the first time. So we'll specifically be examining the workflow for the initial setup that you'll need to do on day one, and then how you'll maintain that environment on an ongoing basis. So this is a cloud environment where I've uploaded the sample data. The sample data that Magento provides does provide a number of CMS pages and products and even some customers and orders. So this is how we're simulating a project that's already in progress. What you're looking at is in a cloud environment, and we're going to recreate what you're seeing here in our local environments using Docker. So here is an outline of the setup steps that we'll be using on day one. We're going to download 3 essential assets for for development to our locals. We're going to prepare the cloud configuration files. We're going to customize those files just a little bit. Then we'll start up the Docker environment. We'll review how to create an env.php file, and then we'll be ready to view our website locally in a browser. All right, so our three essential assets for development are basically your project files or what's in your code repository, the database from the cloud environment, and the media from the cloud environment. These are three essential assets that you would need for any sort of local development, Docker or not. So there's really nothing Docker specific here. We will be using the Magento Cloud CLI. And if you haven't dug into that CLI yet, I would recommend that you do so, because it does give you a lot of convenience. It saves you a little bit of time every day, just because it provides convenient aliases for a number of commands that you would routinely use, like interacting with the Git repository or SSH connections. All of those routine tasks are made easier by the Magento Cloud CLI. So just to show you what that looks like, and on the command line, we're going to do just an MGC command, which is MGC is a built-in alias for the Magento Cloud CLI, so you can save yourself a lot of time by just using that alias. And if you just use the plain MGC command, you're going to get a list of all the projects you have access to, all the cloud projects. And in the leftmost column is the ID that you'll need to supply to the next command, which is mcg get, and then the ID of the project you want to get. And this is just cloning the repository. So it's asking you which directory you'd like to clone the project into, and then what branch you would like to check out initially. And then we're going to go ahead and do a composer install after that, just to get the full amount of files. Magento does supply a script that simulates the build process, but I find that this is somewhat destructive to setting up a local environment, so I don't use that build script. Instead, I just kind of manually use Composer to bring down the dependencies. Okay, so now we have all the project files and we've run Composer install. Next, we'll use the Magento Cloud CLI to get the database. So that's just mgc db dump, and that's automatically, if you have multiple cloud projects, this tool is automatically detecting which project directory you're in and what branch is checked out, and it's going to go into the equivalent environment and dump the database of the cloud environment, and then copy that down to your local, all in one convenient command. So there, now I have a database dump in the root of my project directory. And next we'll use the mgc mount download command, which is basically just an alias for rsync. So we're just rsyncing the media directory of the cloud environment down to our local. So here come all the product images and all the media in the cloud environment. Okay, so next we are going to actually prepare the Docker configuration files. When you're looking at your repository, you might notice that there is no Docker compose.yaml file, which is the main Docker configuration file. We're actually going to dynamically generate that configuration file using another CLI, the ECE Tools CLI. and the Docker build command. So this is a really nice piece of automation that Magento is providing. It does the same job as the cloud environment of taking a look at your services.yaml file, and in that file you have what specific services are defined for this project at different versions. So if you've got, a database and Elasticsearch and maybe RabbitMQ installed on your project, this build command is actually going to take a look at that and give you the appropriate containers to match the specifics of your project. If you have multiple projects, this is going to generate a different Docker configuration that's specific to each project and really accurately reproduces the cloud environment on your local using Docker. So we're gonna do that build process. There's a couple options we're going to use for the build command. The first is mode of developer. There is a production mode or a production Docker configuration that would be more appropriate for testing, doing automated tests, or just a demo of Magento. But since our purpose here is to start development on a project, so we're going to use the development mode of Docker. And then there's also a sync engine option, and we're going to use mutagen. The sync engine is for performance reasons. Instead of directly mounting the project files into the Docker container, which is something you might see in other Docker implementations, this particularly on Macs has a very bad performance, high page load times. So we're actually going to use the sync engine to copy all the project files into the Docker environment, and then that is an active two-way sync. So any changes in one environment would be reflected in the other. And then we're going to move that database dump that we acquired in the last step to a specific location so that it'll automatically be imported. So here we're running that Docker build command, and it's got simple output. It just says configuration was built. So let's take a look at the two configuration files that it has generated in our project. The first is Docker compose.yaml, which is the main Docker configuration file. And if you're not familiar with Docker, it resembles a virtual machine, only there's going to be a different container for each of the services associated with an environment. So you've got a different operating system that's just for the database, and you can see that defined here in this file. We've got a container for the database, a separate container for Redis. Next is Elasticsearch, PHP, FPM. So on and on, there's a number of different containers that are generated to provide a replica of the cloud environment, and just a little bit of configuration on each of those containers that will make them work. The second file that we just jumped to there was in the .docker directory, config.php, and this is a distributable file, so it's intended to be kind of a template or a default. And you might recognize some of the variables and values that are being defined here. These same variables would be in the cloud environment, and they control deployment behavior. This is where things like your connection information for services are supplied, like your database and Redis. And there's also some information on routes, and then some other Magento Cloud variables at the bottom there that just control many different aspects of a deployment. So those are the two configuration files that are dynamically generated. They're very specific to the project. And now we'll take that, the database dump, that long named file there is the database dump we generated in the last step, and we need to move that into .docker/mysql/docker entry point init. directory. And then once we create our Docker environment, actually start it up, that dump file will be automatically imported into the database. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at a slight customization that I make to my Docker environments. This is not a required customization. Things would work as is, but I work on multiple cloud Docker projects, so the customization I like to make is making the namespace a little bit less generic. So just to give you an example, going back into that docker compose.yaml file, you've got, for instance, your database is going to be Magento 2. But if you have, say, 3 cloud projects, they're all going to have their own Docker environment, and the database in each of those environments would be named Magento 2. I prefer when I'm executing SQL queries on a database to, kind of double check the name of that database just to make sure I'm targeting the right database. Easy to get confused when things are named the same, so I'm going to change that database name to something project specific. And then also down here you've got the host name, or this is actually the domain name that you'll put into a browser in order to access this environment, and I'm going to change that from magento2.docker to something project specific, because I wouldn't want multiple projects to be accessed with the same domain name. So I'm going to change basically the namespace, make it more specific for both the database and the base URLs of this project. And there are 2 nice ways to extend those changes so that you're not interfering with the base configuration files. We're going to use a docker compose.override file, and also a .docker/config.php file to make those changes. So the first thing we'll do is create the Docker Compose override configuration file. That file does not exist by default, so you'll have to create it in the root of the project. I'll copy and paste some content into it. And then I'll get the base file and this customization side by side so that it's a little more obvious what's going on. So on the left, you've got the base file, and you've got that in the database environment. You've got the Magento 2 defined as the database name and user. And over on the right, I'm just kind of overriding that particular piece of configuration with something that is more specific to this project. I'm calling this project sample, so I want the database to be called sample and the domain name of the website to be sample.test. And that configuration of the base URL happens in the varnish container, because that is the first container in the environment to actually see a request from the browser. So we make that change in the docker compose.override.yaml file. And we'll need to also make a similar change in another place. We're going to have to create a config.php file in the .docker directory. So we will want to copy that distributable file and just right alongside it have a config.php file, so that we're not overwriting the base file. So we'll do something similar here over in the database section. We'll just rename Magento 2 to sample, or something specific to your project. And then down in the routes section, we'll make that change to the base URL. A couple different places to make that change down in the routes section. Okay, so now after you've done a customization in the config.php file, you do have to run that build tool again. It's kind of a little bit peculiar. You don't want to forget that you have to run that that build script again if you have customized config.php. And the reason for that is those values in the config.php file are actually encrypted and turned into a string that then is added as an environment variable to the Docker environment. So that encryption process actually happens when you run the build command. So you have to run that again after any changes to config.php. Okay, so now we're ready. Our configuration is done. We are ready to start this Docker environment up, and we're going to use another CLI. With Magento is supplying a Docker CLI at bin/docker that has several convenience methods and aliases to help you work with the Docker environment. So we're going to use bin docker up to start up the Docker environment, and then we're going to use a script in the root of the project called mutagen.sh. That will start the file sync. You don't want to forget to do that, otherwise you won't have any project files inside the Docker environment. So the bin docker up command will actually attempt to shut down any previous environments that were running. So it does that first, and then it goes through and it creates all your separate containers, and the output looks like that if it was successful. Now we're going to use a Docker command, Docker PS, just to take a look at those containers. The output is a little bit messy, but the one thing I want to point out here is that the well-known port numbers for services like a database, for instance, where if you're used to accessing that on the port 3306, outside of the Docker environment, that's actually going to have a different port if you're using some kind of SQL browser or SQL application to help you with your database manipulation. You're going to have to use a different port from outside of the Docker environment, and you can find that port using this command. Lots of other information there too, but I find it's essential to know the ports that those services are operating at outside of the Docker environment. And then at the bottom there, I'm starting up the file sync with the command bash mutagen.sh. So that just takes a moment, and then it says it successfully created a session, which is basically, that means the two-way sync is active. Now, depending on the size of your file system and the size of that database that is being imported, remember we put the database in a place where it's automatically being imported. So that started when we issued the bin docker up command. That database import started. You know, if you have a database that's 5 to 10 gigs, sometimes that can take half a day on a local system to import. So if after this point you're having problems, you're just going to want to verify both that the database is fully imported, and you're also going to want to verify that your file system was fully synced, your project files. Okay, so the last file that we'll need to prepare in order to get Magento running is an important one, env.php. Now, somewhat it's not obvious how you would necessarily create this file. I think ideally on a file or on a project that has already been running, someone may have a sample env.php file they can give you. Probably should be up to the technical lead of the project to kind of define a sample env.php that will work in your local, and it would probably also have some application configuration changes like disabling things in Magento that should not be active in a non-production environment. So ideally, you could ask around and find some kind of a sample env.php file. But if there is not one available, I'll show you a convenient way to generate one that will work. So the first thing we're going to do is use the mgc ssh command to log into a cloud environment. So this is just SSHing us into an actual cloud environment. And then we're going to use cat app etc env.php. This is just going to output that cloud env.php file to the screen, and it's easily copy and pastable that way. Lots of more elegant ways to do this, but I'm just showing what is the most accessible way to maybe someone that's new to Unix. This just makes it a pretty easy copy and paste job. So I'm just copying the contents of this file out of the cloud environment, and then I'm going to create the same file on our local and just paste the contents. Now this file does not have values that would work in the local environment, so we're going to regenerate this file so that it does have working values for those connections to services. So we're actually going to use the deployment script that is supplied by Magento. Remember earlier I told you not to use the build script, but the second half of a deployment is the deployment phase. This script is safe to run on your local, and it has a few different advantages. It does a few different things that you would ordinarily have to do manually in your local environment. Here it's regenerating the env.php file, so it's adding the appropriate connection information for the services that Docker has created. And it also goes into your database and it replaces the base URLs with whatever we have customized. And at the end there, it's running setup upgrade. These are all steps that you would have to do manually if you weren't running this script. So I find this script is very convenient to run during an initial setup. Okay, so we're almost done with setup. There are a few more commands that we need to run. We do need to switch to developer mode. Since we ran basically what is trying to emulate the cloud deployment phase, all of our cloud environments are in production mode. The Magento is in production mode. Since we have the intent of doing development in our local environments, we're going to want to switch to developer mode. So there's a command to do that. There's a couple commands that will correctly configure varnish cache. And then we're going to need to reindex Elasticsearch. If you're using Elasticsearch on your project, which I recommend, on your local Docker created an Elasticsearch container that is totally empty. the data there was not copied from the cloud environment. So we're gonna populate the Elasticsearch container with data by re-indexing just your search index. The other indexes are in the database and they were pulled down from the cloud environment and are intact in the local environment. So we're just going to re-index the search index. And then you're also going to want to not forget to add whatever domain name you're using for the project to your hosts file. I won't demonstrate that. There's plenty of other documentation on how to do that. But it's a good thing not to forget at this point. Sometimes that can bite you if you've forgotten to do that little small thing. So just to demonstrate what that looks like, I've copied these commands from the documentation, the setup documentation in DevDocs. So if you need to find them later, they are in the documentation. And these commands are kind of jumping into the Docker environment and running one command and then jumping back out. That's why the output is kind of verbose here. It's just because you're jumping in and out of the containers per command. So if everything is successful, that's what it'll look like. And now to re-index the search index, we're actually going to use a bin docker bash command, which will log us into the Cloud Docker environment. Now from here, we can just use bin Magento CLI commands as normal, just re-indexing, clearing the cache, whatever you need to do. That bin docker bash command just kind of puts you into the Docker environment, and you can use commands you're familiar with. So at this point, if we're lucky and we've done everything correctly, we should be able to bring up the project in a browser and find that it completely resembles and completely recreates what we had in the cloud environment. And it does. This is pre-recorded, so everything was destined to go well. So does anybody have any questions on this point? That was kind of the day one initial setup. Is there anybody have any questions on that?
Yeah, I guess there was an active discussion in chat about some things like how, how the processes run, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Okay, let me get the chat window up. Oh, lots of chats to catch up on. Oh, did you already answer all the questions?
Yeah. I'm just wondering, if guys are looking for something else on top of that, to discuss, for example, how to run multiple projects, even though you cover that, but it's probably, the important thing, etc. So, guys, do you have any other questions?
Yeah, I mean, if you have any more specific questions, you can shout them out to me now. Or I'll be available in the Slack channel as well.
I have a question.
Sure.
Will your slides in this presentation be available on SlideShare or joined in?
Let's see. I mean, the presentation itself is being recorded, and I could figure out somewhere to put the slides as well.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so just a short little last section here. So how will this environment be maintained in an ongoing basis? So for, if you finish up your development task and you've got, 3 more, you're going to have to work on this project for weeks, months, or years. What will maintenance of this development environment look like? The good news is most of what we've already done won't have to be repeated. All of those commands only need to be run during initial setup. What you will want to do is just kind of start up and shut down the environment daily, or if you're switching between different projects that have Docker environments, you're probably going to need to shut down the Docker environment in order to switch to another project. So to do that, you're going to want to use the start and stop, bin docker start, bin docker stop commands. There are also bin docker up and bin docker down, but these both completely destroy any existing environments. So you are going to have data loss using up and down. Your database is going to be deleted, basically. Actually, I don't think it's deleted, but it's dissociated with the container. So it's going to be, unless you're a pro at Docker, you probably aren't going to be able to get the database back. So make sure you're not using up and down unless you intend to completely destroy that environment. Most people I know that are doing development want their database to persist from day to day, from task to task. So in order to get that persistence of your data, use start and stop. And then also remember that whenever you're starting up your Docker environment, you also have to start that file sync as a separate process. So remember to run that mutagen command every day when you start work as well. And you'll be using, pretty much every time you're developing with Docker, you're going to use that bin docker bash command to log in to the Docker environment, and you can then interact with Magento as you usually do. You don't have to remember any funny aliases. You just go in there and use bin/Magento to clear caches, reindex, whatever you need to do. And then the other recommendation that I would make is just to become familiar with all the bin docker CLI commands. So just to review those, you can just go into the bin folder and then open up the Docker script, and it's pretty easy to understand what's there. You can see all the convenient aliases that Magento has provided and kind of see how Magento intends for you to interact with the Docker environment. And then you can also see kind of what's going on under the hood when you're using those CLI commands, so that can kind of illuminate how the Docker environment is working. So this is something I check every time I get a new version of the Docker implementation. I check here to see what updates have happened here. It's a good thing to stay apprised of. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. Love to hear any questions anybody has.
Looks like everything was very clear, and hopefully everyone will actually start trying it at least, and connect to us and Joe, in Slack channel if some questions come up later. Thank you, Joe, very much. It was a great presentation. Thanks for sharing your experience. And at the end of the presentation, I actually wanted to make a few more announcements. So, as you know, we have all this code open source. All the Docker-specific part of code is hosted in the Magento Cloud Docker repository, so feel free to browse it and look essentially what's there. We have, I guess, 17 open issues right now, and many community members are very deeply involved into development of it, essentially. So even like some features you were asking about in chat are already in progress, because we pretty much try to drive this project as a community-driven project. So essentially, whatever the needs are on the partner SI sides, we're trying to get the things ready so that we can make the experience seamless for everyone. And the final thing, I guess, we're planning to drop the release for ECA tools very soon. So actually, look at the release notes from time to time, and we'll also do an announcement in Slack channels once this is out. So I guess from my side that's it, and thanks Joe again for leading this presentation for us. See you next time. Thanks everyone. Bye.